Welcome to Between Two Psychs, a podcast where two psychologists and Board Approved Supervisors deep dive into many of the questions and challenges that provisional psychologists and early career therapists face in everyday practice, during training, throughout the internship, and beyond as they progress into working more independently. Your hosts Isabel Tombleson and Claire Trevitt talk about a range of topics specifically relating to psychologists and therapists who are just starting out.
Morning.
Morning, Isabel.
Hi, Claire.
Good to be back.
Yes.
Our last episode for 2024. Can you believe that?
I know. It's amazing. We've managed to do 12 episodes this year now. This is our 12.
We have. So 2 seasons each.
Yeah. Exciting.
And some more planned for next year as well.
Yes. I think we wanted to let everyone know, before we start today's episode, that we are really grateful for all the feedback that we've received since starting the podcast. I think Claire and I getting feedback from all areas, even noticing that we've got people listening in other countries. And we just want to say thank you for that.
Yes, thank you. Yes, it's been, I was amazed when I checked the other day, 29 countries.
29 countries? Really? I didn't actually know that.
Yeah, incredibly grateful for all your support, and I really love doing this, but it's good to know that people out there are listening. If you're enjoying it, please share with others, because we just like to spread the word and spread the information.
Yes, thank you. And it gives us a lot of energy and excitement, motivation to keep doing the podcast when we see that more and more people are tuning in. And you mentioned next year. Yeah, we have got some big plans for next year. We will be continuing to record this podcast for you.
We will indeed.
Okay, Claire, do you want to introduce what we're doing today?
Yes, so today we're going to discuss a fairly practical topic, and one that relates, I think, to all therapists, regardless of your modality and area of practice, and that is case formulation and treatment planning.
So very practical episode today, but we think these practical episodes are received pretty well from our listeners. And so we're going to try and get through as much content as we can, the time that we've got available. But this is going to, basically, I would suggest getting a notepad and pen out, because you will be able to write down a bunch of notes about what case formulation is, how it leads to treatment planning, and some of the key concepts or essential concepts you want to remember when you're doing this in your practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of information to get through, so we're going to just do our best, bearing in mind that this could probably go on for several hours if we really incorporated everything that comes to mind about this topic. It's a big one.
We'll try and stick to our plan.
Well, indeed.
Okay. The first thing that we want to do is just give an outline for what you can expect from us today. So we are going to discuss case formulation and treatment planning. We're going to talk about why it's essential. We're going to talk about the structure of case formulation and how to direct a good case formulation. We're going to talk about being holistic and tailoring a case formulation to a client in the session. And we're going to give some specific, information on particular theoretical models and formulation formats that you can use when it comes to putting all of the information together.
Yes, there's a lot of information there. The one thing I think I just wanted to say right at the beginning is, while it does feel like a lot of information, and I feel it over time, I'm curious about your perspective, Isabel, but it's something that I feel it's happening much more automatically for me. It's something that, because I've been trained to look for this information, it's something that just happens automatically, and I find myself collecting this information in the first couple of sessions and feeling more able to, readily share that with my client in a really digestible way. So if it feels overwhelming, just remember that this is the beginning, and that it does become a lot more automatic.
That's a really good message. Yes, it will feel strange trying to stick to this structure and remembering all of the components and then making it seem natural and then helping the client to feel uncomfortable and not interrogated. Yeah, it's a skill that takes time to develop.
Yes, certainly is. And I think that's why it helps sometimes to understand why we're actually doing this,
Yeah.
because that then I think makes it easier to articulate what it is that we want to convey back to the client.
So you mentioned wanting to convey back to the client and how you noticed how you're quite natural with how you do it now. I think that maybe the one thing we could talk about just briefly is maybe explaining what we're doing in the beginning and getting consent is a good place to start. Yeah. Do you want to add anything to that?
I completely agree. I think just understanding, I think for the client to understand as well why we're gathering this information, and often that's included in some kind of intake form that we provide. I think when we think about the whole process of therapy, there are so many different steps. And again, some of them are quite automated. I tend to send out some forms to clients before they come to therapy so that I've got a little bit of information. And then just gathering that information in the first session, but letting them know that I think what we're really interested in is who they are and what makes them the way that they are. So, what are those different factors that create the challenges that they're presenting with? Um,
Mm.
and also, what is it about them and who they are that is going to inform how we proceed with treatment and what we can expect from treatment?
You've answered the why there, haven't you? This is why we do case formulation because we need this information. First of all, for the client to feel heard and understood, like we get where they're coming from. We can, see them in a holistic way. But then, yeah, so that we can make sure that what we end up doing with them in treatment is going to be useful.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in terms of, I think, the definition of case formulation for anyone listening who is very new to this, it really is a process that we undertake in collaboration with the client to understand their unique difficulties and challenges and what it is there and expectations as well within their context, and how we connect all of those issues and their history, unconscious sort of psychological processes and everything else that's going on, and how we bring that all together
Mm.
to an overall, I don't want to say conceptual plan, but I guess that's really what it is. It's a sense of us saying, okay, we've got all of this, we can hold all of this, and this is going to help us work out where to go.
Like a roadmap almost. Yeah, like this is where you've come from. This is where even you came from before you were born. I love doing that intergenerational stuff when I do an assessment with someone, which is essentially what we're talking about here. Another word to throw out there: conceptualization, case formulation. This is part of our initial assessment, isn't it? Love getting that intergenerational information. And then this is what I can do with you here, but then where are we going to from here as well? What are the goals? What does future you look like and want?
Yes, because the client, I think, needs to hear that quite early on. And ultimately, our clients want to feel seen, heard, and understood. And so, by having some way of presenting this information back, whether we do it formally through writing it all down and putting it into different sections, which is completely fine, or whether it's just in a general conversation,
Mm.
I think clients feel really heard and understood. And of course, then that's going to lead to much better outcomes because they're going to see that we understand,
Mm.
sense. And you know what? We may not always get it right either. This is a working sort of document. It's a hypothesis, so it can change. We can revise things. So it's not, we've got to get all of this information. We've got to get it perfectly right. We've got to give it back to you in a digestible way that is completely accurate because that's not the case either. So it's quite forgiving. I think as long as we've got most of it, good sense of it there,
Mm.
that's usually we can work on the good enough principle.
Yep, that's a really good suggestion. I think even talking about like the client's experience of it, we want them to walk away from that first session or those first couple of sessions hopefully having thoughts around along the lines of, wow, I never realized that all these things that have happened to me are connected and related to why I feel the way I feel now. Like having a sense of some understanding of themselves is my goal, certainly when I have those first few sessions, like some aha moments or just a sense of someone finally gets me.
Absolutely. And it means that therapy actually started before it started.
Hmm. You hear that sometimes. And I've supervised students, like trainees, who have come to me and said, I had a client and they only came for 1 or 2 sessions and I didn't hear from them again. What did I do wrong? And we will talk about the case. And I'll come to the end and I'll go, actually don't know that you did anything wrong. Did you know that sometimes just having those initial assessment sessions can be enough for some of our clients to be able to walk away and make change themselves? And I love sharing that.
And I think that's a really important factor as well when we think about situations or services where people have a very limited number of sessions. If you've got, say, 3 or 4 sessions, having a really good case formulation can actually be so helpful because you're really presenting the client with something that they can take away, work with, because I think that we can be in such a rush to do the interventions and to do the treatment, but really got an understanding of what's needed, what's going to be helpful for this particular individual, then that's going to, I think, be so important in determining whether or not that's going to be effective
Yeah.
and whether it's going to be what they need, because it is in collaboration with the client. I say, oh yeah, that was a big factor. My history, for example, when you say going back into some of those intergenerational stories, can be quite powerful and for some people incredibly important to revisit and understand and see in context in a way that they may never have done so before.
Mm, mm. So we're not only in those initial sessions where we're doing this assessment, information gathering and formulating. We're not just trying to create a therapeutic relationship between ourselves and the client. In a way, we're strengthening our client's relationship to themselves through insight, awareness, understanding.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it's so powerful.
Yeah. And I think the sooner we can give them a sense of that, ideally within the first couple of sessions, we don't have to give them the whole formulation. But if we can give them a sense of some of that and what we're understanding and feed that back, then I think that's going to be very valuable in setting the scene for therapy. Whether or not we're the therapists that do the ongoing work, because as I said, sometimes you've got a service with 3 or 4 sessions, that may not be possible, but it might give the client a starting point for a longer term arrangement in a different service if you can't provide that in the service that you're in. So it can be of real value.
Mm, mm. And I have this thought around also incorporating into this initial process where we're maybe explaining to the client what to expect and that this is the process that we're going to go through. You can weave in a little bit of psycho ed as well. This is what we do when we do therapy with people, whether you're a social worker or a psychologist. When we're understanding a person's psychology, in order for us to be able to help facilitate change, we've got to know where a person's come from. And I sometimes love having those little sessions where I explain that process or that concept to someone, especially if they're really new to therapy. This is actually what we do. Like, we've got to understand our thoughts. We've got to understand our feelings and our behaviors in the context of who we are. And it's only from there that we can make change, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And because we want to understand our clients, but we also want them to understand themselves.
Totally.
Yeah.
Oh, good message. That's great. Okay. So we've talked about what case formulation is. Just to briefly summarize, it's collaborative. We want to identify patterns and causes. The process will help us to guide a treatment plan, but it's really important to do this process first before jumping to a treatment plan. And we want to strengthen our relationship through this process in a collaborative way with the client, but also help the client to strengthen their relationship with themselves, understand themselves, and create insight and awareness.
I think that's a great summary.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we're moving on to some of the skills of case formulation. So there are a few essential skills that we want to use when we're undertaking a case formulation. There are a couple of things that I think are useful to know in the beginning when we're learning. And the first one is being conversational. So learning how to do this in a way that it doesn't feel like a client's being interviewed, in a way where we maybe are comfortable to be a bit flexible with putting our paper and a pen aside if we can see that the client is needing and seeking connection or needing to be heard. Yeah. Would you like to share your ideas about being conversational, Claire?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think we can get very caught up on, I need to have this information by this point of time. I need to ask this particular question. And so the initial session, if we're not careful, can begin to feel like an interview. And I know we call it sometimes an initial interview. We don't want it to feel like a question and answer session, but more like a conversation where we are, reflecting back. And we're also gathering the information, as you said, Isabel, in a really flexible way, so that sometimes it begins to feel like a flowing conversation rather than okay, there's this section, and now there's this section, and now there's this section, whereby it begins to flow into one, which is what happens in a good conversation. So the client feels as though they're being heard, not interviewed.
Yes, and that's the why as to using a conversational style, isn't it? Because we do want to, I guess, have a client feel heard and feel like they can connect with us and feel safe with us. We don't want to start triggering off of like freeze response in our clients because we're not going to get the best version of themselves if they're feeling unsettled in any sort of ways. But I did have just a thought as you were talking, just to put in a little caption like about being neurodivergent. So if you're a therapist who's neurodivergent, maybe a therapist who's autistic, or if you have a client who's autistic, we're talking here about being conversational. That might be for our non-neurodivergent clients and maybe for us as therapists, because we're pretty comfortable having a conversation. But just want to let you know, if you are autistic or if you've got a client who's autistic, totally okay to find another way that fits that person or for yourself.
Yeah, I think that actually coming right back to the beginning it is around that sort of safety and connection piece, is that what is going to help you? Are there any things that I can put into place that are going to support you with this process? And explaining right at the beginning that I'd like to just know a little bit about you. But of course, and I think in the same way that when we're trauma informed as well, when I say to somebody, I'm interested in what's happening to you, I don't mean that you've got to tell me in great detail all of the things that you went through or even everything. It's more about sharing what's comfortable and ensuring. So I think that's partly what we do. And that's probably when I come back to that intuitive sense of what becomes more automatic, is that getting a sense from our client very early on in their level of comfort with the information that they're providing, with our questions, what they're actually, needing from us, because we want to be able to cater for our individual clients' needs. And some clients may say, I want you to ask me questions and I want to give the answers. But if that's the case, then that's what we do. And also being very clear about what we are asking. If we have specific questions, I tend to be so broad that when a client comes into me, I'll say, I'm interested in two main things: what brings you here today and what you're hoping to get from being here. They're two very broad questions. And I'll say, you don't have to answer those questions specifically, although you can if you want to.
Yeah.
This is the type of thing I'm interested in. So if you're comfortable to share with me what brings you, that's a good starting point.
Love that. That's a really nice guide. And I think that's a practical and maybe a realistic thing for our listeners to take away. Certainly keeping in the back of our mind as you're using those questions, some of the components of the case formulation that you'd like to fill in that session with that client, but maybe not being too directive in that and allowing it to flow intuitively.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but I find myself at the end of the first session, I also don't take any notes in sessions. Even my first session, I was told to take notes, so I don't. And so it will be a conversation. And then at the end of the session, I madly write down as much as I can remember. And I do have a format that I write into. So I've got lots of prompts for myself.
Right.
And yeah, I miss things there. I think,
Mm.
next time I'm going to ask more about what life was like at school, for example, because I didn't get that. And so it prompts me to think about what I can bring into the conversation. So I keep that in my mind.
Mm.
Now I want to bring that up when the time feels right.
And that's been very client person centered, isn't it? Like we're really allowing the client, and especially if there's been trauma experiences, allowing the client to be in control of the session. It's a great way to be trauma informed.
Yes, I
I
think
think it's tricky to do that when we're learning though.
we have. I think it's important that we are attuned to whatever the presentation is in front of us, and so each person is going to maybe come with a different experience. But if we can be attuned to them, then we're going to connect with them and help them feel calm.
Mm. We're talking a lot about client therapist relationship being flexible, person centered, intuitive. I want to add, if anyone's has some knowledge about polyvagal theory, so I like to think about polyvagal theory when I think about co-regulation. So being in tune with myself and how I sense that the other person is feeling, using that to help me guide how I interact and where I go to next as well can be useful. I am noticing that someone might be having a fight, flight, freeze reaction, maybe pausing and checking in, ground, like maybe doing some ground and something like that. Just, yeah, I think that's a nice little thing to add into this sort of list of skills for this case formulation process.
Oh, absolutely. I just love that concept of co-regulation because that's essentially what we are trying to
Yeah.
do in this process. We are trying to be that person that will be attuned to our clients
Mm.
and help them stay in a place that feels manageable for them throughout the session.
Yeah. So that's why we talk about being person centered, about being flexible, all that, because it is about that sense of comfort and safety for the client. We want them to come back. And so even if we are brand new and we're maybe having a therapy session with our first client next year in the course that you're doing, just be aware that it's completely okay if you only get a little bit of the initial assessment information, case formulation stuff, because really that the client's experience of that first session with you and feeling safe is like more important than the rest.
It is. And I think, and if you don't get all the information as well, that's often quite telling in terms of how is the client presenting to you. Are they speaking very quickly, going off on tangents? Is everything very coherent and you're getting every single bit of information because they're understanding what you're doing? Whatever you get is going to be useful information. How the client presents is also going to give you some useful information for that conceptualization, particularly in how they're going to be able to use the therapy.
Feel like we could do a whole episode just on that. On that. We'll pause right now. We might need to do that next year.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So there are a couple of other skills in undertaking a case formulation. So we've already talked about gaining consent, being conversational, being curious, having a curious and non-judgmental stance is really useful. And using our body language to convey that as well, being mindful of our facial expression, how we hold our bodies, and being aware of our own, like arousal, our own nervous system, making sure that we remain super calm, super grounded, super relaxed. Even if we're brand new and it's our first client and we're doing this for the first time, doing everything we can to pace ourselves, to nose breathe through that process, diaphragmatic breathe as well through that process so that our nervous system knows that even though this might be a little bit nerve-wracking and a little bit of anxiety, it's good to keep us on our game. We don't have to tip over into a full-on fight freeze with us.
Yeah, it can be nerve-wracking when we're first starting out, and looking after ourselves in the therapy room and outside is just so important. And one of the things that I actually notice as well it's around my posture. And I notice when I am feeling very slightly activated, I feel like I move in towards clients and I go towards action. And so I want to do something more. And now I'm attuned to that, I will often bring myself back in, align myself and feel like I'm opening up to the curiosity again rather than closing into, oh no, what do I need to do here to do this, which is much more about me. So yeah, just observing how you feel in the room can be really helpful, and we'll all have our different ways of managing that. But yeah, certainly that's something that I've learned over time as well, because this is quite nerve-wracking. I really don't want to minimize how vulnerable and how responsible. Sorry, can we take out vulnerable? Um, sorry, I want to start that a bit again. I really don't want to minimize just how daunting it can be for new therapists to undertake the process and the level of responsibility that we can really feel. And so taking care of ourselves in the process is really important, and also being really gentle on ourselves, because at the end of the day, the client is coming to you in the hope that you can help them. And I think if we can actually keep that space open for a client to share, and we can listen and we can be attentive, I think that is just as important as all of this information gathering and getting all the right things.
Mm, mm. Lovely. Such a lovely message. Okay. There are a couple of other things that we want to do, a couple of other skills that we're going to use when we're doing a case formulation. And that is, we do want to, if we can, I think we've already talked about it, but keep in the back of our mind some of the aspects of information that we do want to try and gather, but keep it conversational. So just the layout of a case formulation includes presenting problem, the reason for coming to treatment. We do want to also, at some point, if we can, find out the developmental history, and that might include significant events that people have been through, particular trauma events as well, can be very useful information together. And we want to identify some of the perpetuating factors as well. So if we're using a 5-piece formulation model, we want to know what's going on at the moment that seems to be preventing the person from making change themselves. Why is it that they've come to a therapist to get help with this? What barriers are there to them being able to move forward? Would you add anything? Oh, protective factors.
Yes, I think the protective factors can often feel like add-ons, but they're so important, because that's what tells us about the client's capacity, what they can do, what strengths that they have, and how they've actually survived what they've survived. Because ultimately, as somebody who works in trauma, when I hear people's stories, I'm quite flabbergasted at how somebody, managed to be so resourceful to get through some of the things that people have experienced. And when it's very complex and quite horrific trauma at times, some of these individuals can be incredibly resourceful and function incredibly well at some level. Often they don't see that. So sometimes it is our job to reflect back some of the things that we're seeing that are so positive about the
and not tacking it on at the end, but incorporating it throughout its whole interaction in those first couple of sessions. Yeah. I'm so glad we talked about that, because I do that just all the time now. I'm constantly listening for the strengths, and I'm constantly reflecting them and trying to positively reinforce them as well, highlight them.
Yeah, and it's that real balance, isn't it, between there are lots of challenges. So we don't want to minimize the challenges and say, oh, but I'm resourceful, and haven't you managed to do all of these things and get past all of this? We don't want to minimize the challenges and the difficulties that they are experiencing and why they've come to us. So sometimes it's a delicate balance, and it's both. Wow, you are so resourceful, yet and see how you struggle.
This is pain. There's still pain here. There's still struggles. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we're looking really at the 5P model. It's sometimes called the 4P model. The 5P model includes the presenting. And so we've got the presenting issue in terms of why the clients come. The predisposing factors is, as you said, the history and anything that contributes to the vulnerability So why an individual may be predisposed to what's happened here. Often the history, and there may be factors during childhood that have occurred that, or there may be some genetic factors as well. So often we're looking at the biopsychosocial model. So we're looking at the physical, the biological, the psychological, and also the social, the environment.
Mm.
And so there are some very nice, when you can get some very nice online, some almost charts whereby you can fill in the information, the biological, the physical and the social for each of those 5 factors that can sometimes be quite helpful. And there will be more information in some sections than others, but that can be quite a helpful way initially to conceptualize, because it's okay, this is the information that we need. Let's put it in all into a format. And you can even share some of that with the client as long as it's centered. And the other thing I think that is also important to mention is like the trigger factors, the precipitating factors, like what brings the person to therapy right now or last month, but right now. So often there are things that are going on in the client's life in the present that have brought them to therapy, or it's just accumulated. And that can also be really helpful to get into context, because it gives us a sense of where they're sitting at the moment
Mm.
in the context of their history, but also where they want to go.
I want to mention, when I was learning, and even still now, when I'm doing my formulation with the 5 Ps model, sometimes the precipitating and the perpetuating can get a bit confused. And I just want to normalize that, because they're both precipitating things that have happened in more recent times that have maybe triggered the vulnerability or the challenges. And then the perpetuating factors, I see those as happening in the present day. But if precipitating have happened really recently and they're connected to the perpetuating in some way, it can get a bit confusing. And I just want to encourage you, unless you're having to write a case report for university, you want to make sure that you get it passed for that. Try not to overthink it too much, criticize yourself too much. The important thing is that you have that information. And when you deliver it to the client, I find that's where it comes out really well. Like when you're explaining a formulation to a client, which I do love to do still, and encourage you, if they're listening, to do that as well. That's where we'd say to a client, this is how I make sense of you. These are the things that predispose you. These are the things that maybe even happened intergenerationally, but genetically before you even came to this earth, and then events that are relative. And it makes so much sense that you're having the challenges that you are now, because these events have been triggered for your vulnerability. And up until this point, you haven't had to know how to deal with these sorts of things yet. So yeah, and that can be very nice and validating as well.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. This isn't about you've got to get full marks for this, and you've got to get everything in the right boxes. It's about how we reflect the information and getting a broad understanding. So not getting too caught up in those details. That's such an important point, because we can get very caught up in those things and lose the point of the exercise.
Yep. Yeah. Most of the time, hopefully we've got nice supportive supervision. We're not being graded, and we don't have to feel like we need to just perfect everything, because otherwise, that'll just get in the way of us being able to move forward.
It certainly will, and it will affect our own capacity to be present and to co-regulate in the session. And those things are much more important than getting this little detail.
Yeah, definitely. Let's see if there wasn't any other things. I think, we talked about wanting to encourage our listeners to use storytelling, or encourage our clients to use storytelling. That's really nice. If we have a client who wants to share with us a story about their life in these initial sessions, that's okay. And let that happen. It's a sign that they're feeling comfortable with us.
Yes, exactly. And that's about, again, going off that kind of interview script and letting the client digress a little bit, because it's all useful information. Anything that the client gives us, even if they say, well, this is always useful information.
And yeah, I think we've basically covered everything that we wanted to there. I'll just do a really brief summary. And I'm modeling a skill here, which we can do as therapists with our clients in these initial sessions. If you're having a first session with someone, feel free to pause and summarize what you've heard and what you've gathered before you move on to maybe the next part of that session. So we've talked about some of the skills of the case formulation when we're with the client and we're conducting them. We've emphasized being conversational, being curious. We've talked about the use of body language, being in tune with the arousal level of ourselves and the client, and using co-regulation to help us be present and grounded in that moment to support the person. We've talked about being non-judgmental, being really flexible, and being very person-centered. And there are those essential components to a case formulation: predisposing, precipitating, perpetuating, protective, and then presenting comes first. But it's okay if you don't get all that information in the first or even second session. It's a working document, and just keep in mind that the relationship and the sense that the client has, the feeling of safety that the client has with us is most important.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful summary there. Thank you. And in terms of treatment planning, usually it's going to be information from the perpetuating factor, those maintaining factors, that is going to be relevant to what we actually do next and how we begin to support our clients with some of those challenges. And if we've presented the information back to them in a meaningful way, then the client is going to have an understanding of some of those factors. And then we can begin to give them some choice as to, well, which of these gets in the way? Which of these feels like it's most pressing to address? For example, if we're going to work in a very client-centered manner, that would be how I would use that information to then think about what next and how we begin to plan what we're going to address. And that's going to depend very much on a number of factors in terms of how many sessions we've got, and maybe also the complexity of what is being presented. And if there is a lot of complexity, where are we even going to start?
And then what are we trained in? What's our therapeutic modality? What can we offer? Yeah, time, length of treatment, all of that is totally going to dictate the treatment plan options that we provide. So I so love that you mentioned about providing options, at least having 2 options. I'm in a service where I can only provide around 6 sessions, but I'd still like to provide options, like we could go down this pathway or this pathway. And again, like I'm in a service where I'm meant to be providing a drug and alcohol intervention. Drug and alcohol and mental health go together. I still like to be able to provide options that are tailored to, as you said, the perpetuating factors, the things that are making it hard for the client to be able to move forward on their own.
Yeah, I think that choice is so important, because we might think, you know what, that's a real block for this client, and really flag that as something that could be helpful. But that may feel either less important, or it might feel just too much right now for the client. And some issues will also be an ongoing process. We won't just, okay, today we're going to work on this, and by the end of the session, that's going to be done and dusted. Normally that's not the case, but it's an ongoing conversation.
Mm.
And I feel that particularly provisional psychologists and early career therapists, we really want sometimes a plan. We really want to have a sense of where we're going. And I think that sense of direction is important. It can be quite containing. But I think it is so important to also ensure that is a collaborative process and very much based on what's important to the client, and not necessarily, this client's presenting with depression. I've got a manual on working with depression, so therefore we're going to try this. It might be that you say that. They say, look, I really want to work on my depression. And then you can say, actually, I've got a bit of a process we could work through. How does that sound to you? And they might say, fabulous. And there you go. You can begin to implement that. But often that we're looking for a lot more flexibility. And I think sometimes we can spend a lot of time planning for a session, particularly an individual session, and then the client comes with something completely different.
Oh, yes.
And all of that work
Yeah.
been in vain. It hasn't been in vain because, of course, you've done some research and you've got some useful information that you'll use at some point. But again, that flexibility and not getting too caught up in this is the plan for session 2 and this is what we're going to do, because it doesn't always work out like that. And I do get concerned when people are spending significant time planning for sessions. I think a loose plan and a bit of a guide or a frame can be helpful. But yeah, spending hours and hours preparing for a single session or a series of sessions can often leave therapists quite frustrated and disappointed.
Mm.
It doesn't go according to plan.
Yeah. If you find that you want to do that, use it as like an educational activity rather than this is how I'm going to do it and this is how it needs to go sort of thing. It can certainly be useful when we're in the early stages of learning and doing therapy to imagine or write out how you would do things. This is how I would do this, but bearing in mind early on, we know that our clients we want our clients to be able to direct the session as they need.
Yeah. And I think, as you say, when we're very early on, we are looking for some structure. I personally think that one of the best ways that we can plan treatment is to train in a model of therapy and train well in a model of therapy so that we know how to apply it according to various different parts of the process.
Mm.
So we've got those tools already under our belt.
Mm.
And so I feel like the best way that we can plan is more of a framework than individually. So even if you're using like those manualized processes, get familiar with the whole manual. Get
Yeah, good
familiar
advice.
like what's required at different stages, because your client may come in one week and benefit from what's in chapter 10 rather than what's in chapter 2.
Yeah. That's such good and I know I've done that. Yeah, I've had a client come in and I'm like, "We're just gonna skip. This is what you're talking about today. How about we look at this?" "Oh, yes, that's" yeah, and then the client goes, yeah, 100% right," and we move on. Yeah, great advice.
Yeah, absolutely. And coming back to that, I think that the case formulation is usually going to be informed by a model of therapy. So the way that we present it back to our
Mhm.
clients will usually be in a way that feels aligned with the way that we work. So if we are CBT trained and that's the way that we work, we are probably going to be drawing on those cognitions and those beliefs.
Mm.
And if we're trained in, like in psychodynamic therapy, I'm probably looking at some of those relational elements and some of the unconscious processes that might be going on.
Mm.
And it's going to be very different for depending on the individual
Mm.
and what is going to be. And that's why it's so unique. But having a therapy framework that we feel comfortable in, and it doesn't matter what modality it is, but I think it's helpful to have good training in one modality so that you're not feeling like, oh, I'm drawing on this for this and this for this and this for this. So this is DBT, this is ACT, this is CBT. That's okay to do when you've got an understanding of how they integrate.
Mm.
When we're just picking at bits and pieces, it can get confusing. And so it's more about helping get that clarity to start with and then thinking, now I'm trained in the CBT model. Now I can begin to introduce this component of it because that's going to be what's needed, but knowing how it fits into a broader model.
And that's such a really good thing. We're approaching the end of the episode now. I'm so glad you mentioned that. You're absolutely right. How we explain our conceptualization to our client will be based on the model that we're trained in. And because a part of that process is that we're then explaining the rationale to the client. This is how I conceptualize you. This is what's recommended. This is the treatment that's recommended based on your formulation. because the formulation needs to lead logically to the treatment options, and then giving them a bit of psycho ed so that they understand. So I use a lot of schema therapy in my role, and so I will explain briefly what schemas and modes are, and provide like a worksheet so that it can back up what I'm saying and be an additional resource for the client. And I'll check in with them. Is this making sense to you? When I explain these concepts to you in a really brief way, is it connecting or resonating? And if I get a positive response from that, then usually they'll say yes. And I'll say, this is what we could look at doing for the next few sessions. And that's how we get that I guess that be collaborative, but also use our knowledge to explain and get consent to move forward.
And then therapy's actually started before it started, because we're doing the assessment, but as part of that assessment, we're giving the client a little bit of a taste of what therapy's like.
Yeah. And I'll even do that in the first session, even if I haven't got all of the assessment information. If I've got a presenting problem and I've got a bit of the predisposing, a bit of the perpetuating, and a bit of precipitating, I'll start to share that back with the client. So when I hear you talk, I'm hearing you say X, Y, and Z. And I'm noticing this, have you thought about how there's a connection between these things, or how this has made you a bit more vulnerable to stress given this precipitating situation that's happened? Yeah, and it's okay if you do that. The reason why I'm sharing that with you, because I found that just happened intrinsically really early on for me. I wanted to help the client to understand how I was processing and conceptualizing their story, so that they could get a sense that early on that I was already starting to make sense of them, and already starting to think about some of the work we could do. So instilling hope and stuff like that.
Absolutely. I think we owe that to our clients at the end of their first session. We owe them something, understanding of what we've taken from what they've told us, and to be able to reflect that back to them. Yeah, I actually think we owe that to our clients, to give them some reflection of our understanding at the end of the very first session, because they're coming to us, they're really sharing some very private, personal, vulnerable information. And I think we really owe that to our clients, to really give them some feedback, to share some of our own understanding of their difficulties and challenges. Because, of course, they've come to us with some very vulnerable and personal information. And that's really what they're looking for, is to feel understood. So if we can demonstrate that to them right at the end of the session, or throughout the session, the first session, that's going to give them a sense that they feel heard, they feel understood, this person gets me, they get what I've been through, they see my strengths, they see me as a person. That's what I'd be hoping to really reflect back to a client within the first session.
Nice. I'm really glad we mentioned that. It wasn't on the plan, but it's nice as we're having these conversations that we're able to share just those intrinsic skills and pieces of knowledge that we have just from doing the work ourselves for as long as we have. And I think hopefully our listeners will find this episode very practical. And I am aware that we've got a whole lot of new students starting in the new year, their masters or professional masters programs. This will be a great, piece of a great resource, hopefully, for you. Please give us your feedback. If you do think it's been useful, as we mentioned earlier, please share the podcast with your co-workers and your peers so that we can get to as many people as we can. Claire and I are really passionate about providing this source of information in a manner that's free, so that we can all be on an equal playing field. We can all start out with the foundations that we need in the beginning that we might not necessarily be getting through our training programs or through our other supervisors.
And also, please let us know if there is anything else that you would like for us to cover, because we are very open to exploring
any
topics in relation to psychology.
We want to know what's going to be useful for you. And also, while we're at it, Claire and I are just going to plug that we do have some openings for supervision next year. So if you're interested in receiving some one-on-one supervision, or maybe even some group supervision, make sure you get in touch with us. Claire, do you want to plug your page?
Yes, I'm on the growingtherapist.com.au. I don't have individual supervision listed on there. I do that through my private practice holistic psychology services, but you're welcome to get in touch with me via either website. And I do actually have for the first time in a number of years, I do actually have a couple of openings for supervision. So if you're looking for a new supervisor, I love supporting early career and provisional psychology.
Nice, nice. And my website's up and running now. It's thepsychologistwithin.com.au, and my contact details are on that website. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, and wishing you all the best for the end of the year and the holiday period. Hope you've got something relaxing planned, and we'll look forward to connecting with you in 2025.
2025. Bring it on. Thanks, everyone. See ya.
Thank you for tuning in today. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to leave us a 5-star rating. It really helps others find the show. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Between Two Psychs for more updates and resources. For more information and to explore everything we offer, head over to our website, betweentwopsychs.com.au. We appreciate your support, and we'll see you next time.